The letter arrived at midnight, and it ruined everything. Duke Alistair Thornwood stood in the entrance hall of his own house, still in his riding coat, reading the same 3 lines over and over, as if reading them a 4th time would change the words. His translator was gone. Not late, not delayed by weather or a broken carriage wheel. Gone, across the channel, with another man's wife and a stolen advance on his salary, leaving behind nothing but a note that said he was sorry and a set of empty ink bottles. In 4 days, the French and Prussian delegations would arrive at Thornwood Hall to finish a treaty that stood between his family and complete financial ruin. 3 years of negotiation, 2 years of his father's failing health spent trying to save it, and now, 4 days before the final signing, Alistair had no one who could speak a word of French beyond ordering wine, and no one who could read a line of German beyond a nursery rhyme. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with maps of language he did not understand, spread across the desk like a battlefield he had already lost. By morning, he had sent riders to every corner of the county. Find me a translator, any translator. French, German, Russian, if such a miracle existed. Pay whatever is asked. The replies came back slow and useless. A retired naval officer who remembered some French from his youth, most of which turned out to be curses. A vicar's son who could read Latin beautifully and nothing else. A woman in the next county who claimed fluency and turned out to know exactly 11 words, all of them related to bread. Alistair's aunt, Lady Margaret, arrived on the 3rd day with a list of names and an expression that told him she already knew he would hate every single one of them. They are not soldiers, Alistair. Stop looking at the list like it insulted your mother. I need someone who can translate a trade agreement, not attend a dinner party. These women can do both. That is rather the point of women, dear boy. We are required to do everything and thanked for none of it. He scanned the list without real hope. Names of daughters and widows and companions, women who had sat through seasons of balls and returned home each year a little more forgotten. His eyes stopped near the bottom. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, age 29, unmarried. He knew the name the way one knows the name of a house that burned down long ago. There had been a scandal, years back, an engagement broken. He remembered whispers more than facts, the way society remembers everything, in fragments designed to hurt rather than inform. Not her, he said. Why not her? Because everyone stopped inviting her to anything worth attending. That tells me something. Margaret's mouth flattened into a line he recognized from childhood, the one that appeared right before she proved him wrong. It tells you what people believe. It does not tell you what is true. And you, Duke Thornwood, are currently drowning. Beggars do not get to choose the color of the rope. He hated that she was right. He hated it more than he hated the empty ink bottles sitting on his desk like small glass tombstones. He agreed to the interview only because the alternative was watching his family's fortune collapse in front of foreign dignitaries who would smile through the entire humiliation. Eleanor Whitmore arrived at Thornwood Hall on a gray afternoon in a plain brown coat, carrying herself like a woman who had long ago stopped expecting doors to open easily for her. She did not curtsy too low. She did not smile too wide. She simply waited to be shown in, hands folded, spine straight, the posture of someone who had learned that dignity was the one thing no one could take from her twice. Alistair studied her from behind his desk, the way he studied every problem he did not yet trust. Plain features, sharp eyes, dark hair pulled back with no ornament at all. Nothing about her matched the stories he vaguely remembered, stories about a foolish woman who had lost her only chance and never recovered. Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Thank you for the consideration, Your Grace, though I suspect I was rather far down a very long list. He did not deny it, and something in her expression suggested she had expected honesty more than flattery. I need someone fluent in French and German for a treaty negotiation of considerable importance. My aunt believes you may be capable. Your aunt is correct. No hesitation, no modest deflection, just fact, delivered plainly, the way one might state the hour. He slid a letter across the desk, one that had arrived from the French delegation that morning, full of formal diplomatic language designed to appear polite while delivering an insult. He wanted to see if she would simply read the words or actually understand them. Eleanor picked it up. Read it once, silently, then again. "They are calling your terms unserious," she said, without looking up. Not directly. It is buried in the third paragraph, in a phrase that translates cleanly as considering the modest scope of your Grace's proposal. It sounds respectful. It is not. In formal French diplomatic correspondence, modest scope is a phrase reserved for insulting a position without appearing to insult it. Alistair went very still. His previous translator had read that same letter 2 weeks earlier and called it a courteous acknowledgement. "Read me the second page," he said, in German. She switched languages the way most people switched rooms, without pause, without visible effort. Then he asked for Italian, testing her, half expecting her to falter. She did not falter. He asked for Russian, a language he barely trusted himself to pronounce, let alone verify, and she answered in it as easily as she had answered in French. "How many languages?" he asked, and he heard his own voice come out quieter than he intended. "Do you actually speak?" "7, Your Grace, fluently. I read in 2 more, though I would not claim mastery there." 7, yes. And no one in society knows this. Something passed behind her eyes, fast, gone before he could name it. No one in society asked. The silence that followed sat heavy in the room, filled with a question he did not yet have the right to ask, about years spent invisible, about intelligence folded up small enough to fit inside a life no one wanted to look at twice. "You are hired, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Effective immediately. The negotiations begin in 4 days." She nodded once, businesslike, as though he had simply confirmed something she already knew to be true. He did not yet understand what he had just done. He only knew, dimly, that the woman standing in front of him had just saved his family from ruin, and that everyone who had ever dismissed her as unremarkable had been catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. That night, alone in his study, Alistair found himself rereading the French letter Eleanor had translated, searching for the insult she had found so easily. He found it eventually, buried exactly where she said it would be. He sat back in his chair and stared at nothing for a long moment. 5 seasons. 5 disappointments, according to the list his aunt had given him. A woman with a gift rare enough to save an empire's worth of trade agreements, and society had spent a decade calling her the one nobody wanted. He did not know yet what had truly happened to end her engagement all those years ago. He only knew the story he had been told did not match the woman he had just met, and that mismatch sat in his chest like a stone he could not put down. 4 days. He had 4 days to save his family's fortune, and the only person capable of doing it was a woman the world had already decided to forget. He intended to make sure the world noticed her again. Eleanor moved into the east wing of Thornwood Hall the following morning, carrying 1 trunk and a wooden box of books she refused to let the footman touch. She had learned, long ago, that trunks could be lost and replaced. Books, once gone, were gone forever. The household noticed her before she had finished unpacking. Maids paused in hallways to watch her pass. A footman named Edward, young and unguarded with his opinions, muttered to another servant that it was strange, a woman living under the same roof as the Duke, unmarried, unchaperoned in any real sense, working alone with him for hours behind a closed door. Eleanor heard him. She always heard things like that. 10 years of practice had given her an ear tuned specifically to the frequency of her own reputation being discussed. She did not react. She had learned that reacting only fed the story. She simply walked past Edward, set her box of books down in her assigned room, and began preparing for the work that had actually brought her there. The first documents Alistair handed her were dense and technical, full of trade terms and shipping rights and tariff structures written in language designed to be misunderstood by anyone who was not already an expert. She read through them at the long table in his study, a pot of tea cooling beside her, marking passages with small, precise notes in the margin. "You write faster than you speak," Alistair observed, watching her from across the table. "I have had more practice writing alone than speaking to anyone who listens." It was said plainly, without self-pity, the way she said most things, but he felt the weight of it land somewhere behind his ribs anyway. Their work fell into a rhythm over the following days. He would bring her a letter, a proposal, a demand phrased to sound generous while hiding a trap. She would read it twice, then explain not just the words but the intention behind them, the diplomatic games layered beneath formal courtesy. He began to realize that his previous translator, however competent with vocabulary, had never once caught the actual game being played. Eleanor caught it every time. "They are trying to move the shipping clause before the tariff clause," she said one evening, pointing to a paragraph in a German document. "It looks like a simple reordering. It is not. If the shipping clause comes first, they can argue the tariff terms were agreed to under a different set of assumed conditions. It is a trick as old as trade itself." "How do you know these things?" "I read. For years, when there was very little else expected of me, I read everything I could find. Trade law, diplomatic history, old treaties, some of them a century dead, still fascinating for the tricks they contain." She looked up from the page. "Nobody asks a woman what she does with her solitude, Your Grace. So I filled mine with something useful." He found himself staring at her longer than the conversation required, and looked away first. Word of her skill began to travel through the house even before the delegations arrived. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Clara who had served the Thornwood family for 30 years, found an excuse to bring in tea herself one afternoon, simply to observe the woman everyone was discussing. "She reads the letters like they are gossip," Clara reported to the kitchen staff afterward, sounding almost delighted. "Like she is finding out who insulted who at a dinner party. Never seen anything like it." The gossip about her intelligence began to compete, slowly, with the gossip about her past. It did not erase it. Eleanor doubted anything could erase 10 years of whispers. But it complicated the story, and complication, she had learned, was sometimes the closest thing to fairness a woman like her could hope for. On the third night before the delegations arrived, Alistair found her still working long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. Candles burned low around her, and she sat with 3 documents spread in front of her, cross-referencing a phrase between them, with the focus of someone solving a puzzle no one else could see. "You should rest," he said. "I will, when I am finished." "You have said that for the past 3 nights. And I have finished, each time, exactly when I said I would." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, though there was no document requiring his presence, no translation needed at that hour. He simply wanted, he realized, to sit near the quiet certainty she carried, the way some people wanted to sit near a fire in winter. "Can I ask you something," he said, "that has nothing to do with the treaty?" She set down her pen, folding her hands, giving him the same attentive stillness she gave every letter placed in front of her. "You may ask, why did you never marry?" The question sat in the air between them, and for a moment he regretted asking it, watching something close briefly behind her eyes before opening again, guarded but not hostile. "I was engaged once," she said, "a long time ago. It ended. Society decided the story it preferred to tell about why, and I have spent a decade living inside that story, rather than my own. What is the true story?" She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he had earned the answer yet. "Not tonight, Your Grace. Some things require more trust than a few days of shared work can build." He accepted this, though it cost him something to do so, and the two of them sat in silence for a while longer, the candles burning down, the treaty documents waiting patiently between them, like a third presence in the room that had, for a moment, been forgotten entirely. The delegations arrived the next morning in a procession of dark carriages and colder manners. The French envoy first, a narrow, precise man named Henri Devereux, who spoke English fluently, but preferred to conduct business in his own tongue whenever possible. A habit Alistair suspected was designed specifically to create advantage. The Prussian delegation followed an hour later, led by a broad, unsmiling man whose formality made the entire drawing room feel several degrees colder simply by his presence. Eleanor stood beside Alistair through the introductions, dressed plainly but precisely, her posture giving away nothing of the nerves he suspected she must feel, facing men who represented the exact kind of society that had spent a decade deciding she was unremarkable. Devereux looked her over once. The assessment brief and dismissive, the look of a man cataloging furniture rather than meeting a person. "Your translator, Your Grace?" "Yes." "How refreshing," Devereux said, in a tone that suggested it was not refreshing at all, to see a woman included in matters of consequence. Eleanor answered before Alistair could, in flawless French, a reply so precise and so quietly firm in its formal courtesy that Devereux's expression flickered, just once, before settling back into practiced neutrality. Alistair did not understand every word of it. He understood enough to know that his translator had just, in the space of a single sentence, informed a seasoned diplomat that she would not be underestimated twice. The negotiations began that afternoon and continued for the following 2 weeks, each day bringing fresh documents, fresh maneuvers, fresh attempts by both delegations to extract advantage through language subtle enough to slip past anyone not paying close attention. Eleanor caught every attempt, every single one. She caught the Prussian delegates' careful rewording of a shipping deadline, designed to buy them an extra month without appearing to ask for it. She caught Devereux's habit of complimenting a proposal in French right before undermining it in the same sentence, a trick that had apparently worked on English diplomats for decades simply because no one bothered to translate closely enough. She caught, on the 9th day, a clause buried in Latin legal phrasing within a German document, a clause that would have quietly transferred certain trade rights permanently rather than for the agreed-upon term of years. "They nearly took your northern shipping lanes forever," she told Alistair that evening, her voice carefully even, though he could see the effort it cost her to stay calm. "Forever, Your Grace. Not for the treaty term. Forever." Buried in 6 words of legal wording no one else in this house would have caught. "You caught it. I caught it, because I have spent 10 years with nothing better to do than learn exactly how documents like this hide exactly what you just described." He looked at her then, really looked, and felt something shift in his understanding of her entirely, some final piece falling into place. The years society had spent calling her wasted, unclaimed, unmarried, had in fact been years spent building something extraordinary, something that had just saved his family's fortune from a trap so quiet it would have taken years to even notice the loss. "Thank you," he said, "does not seem sufficient." "It rarely is," Eleanor said, "but it is a start most people never bother to offer." Late that same night, after the delegations had retired and the house had gone quiet, Alistair found her once more in the study, though this time she was not working. She sat by the window instead, looking out at the dark grounds, a single candle burning low beside her. "You are not reading," he observed. "I am thinking." "About the treaty?" "About how strange it is," she said, "to finally be seen for the thing I spent a decade hiding, after being seen for so long only through the thing I could not control." He sat across from her, uninvited but not unwelcome, and the two of them let the silence stretch comfortably, filled with the particular closeness that grows between two people who have spent long nights solving the same difficult problem, and are only beginning to realize the problem was never really the treaty at all. The 11th day of negotiations began with a change in the room that Eleanor felt before she understood it. A third man had joined the Prussian delegation overnight, arriving in the dark hours and entering the drawing room that morning with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person present. His name was Baron Frederick Ashgrove, an English nobleman married into Prussian trade circles, brought in specifically to advise on matters where a native understanding of both worlds might prove useful. Alistair had never met him. Eleanor had. She recognized him the moment he stepped through the door, and something in her spine went rigid, though nothing on her face changed. Frederick recognized her a half-second later, and unlike Eleanor, he did not bother hiding it. His eyebrows lifted. A small, unpleasant smile crossed his mouth, the kind of smile reserved for old gossip rediscovered. "Miss Whitmore," he said, in English, loud enough for the room to hear. "What an unexpected turn of fortune. Translating for a duke, how far you have come." The words themselves were nothing. It was the undertone beneath them that mattered, the implication that a woman like her, once dismissed, once discarded, had no business standing anywhere near a room like this. Eleanor's hands stayed folded. Her voice, when it came, was level. "Baron Ashgrove, I did not expect to see a face from Lord Pemberton's old circle here." The name landed like a small explosion, quiet but unmistakable. Alistair, standing beside her, did not know the name Pemberton, but he saw the flicker cross Devereux's face, the sudden, sharpened interest of a diplomat who has just found a loose thread worth pulling. "Ah, yes," Frederick said, settling into a chair with the unhurried cruelty of a man who enjoyed an audience. "Pemberton, your former fiancé, was he not? I recall the story rather well. The whole season discussed little else, as I remember." The room did not go silent, not exactly, but the quality of the silence changed, attention gathering the way weather gathers before a storm. Eleanor's composure held for exactly one sentence. "I fail to see," she said, "how my personal history bears any relevance to a trade negotiation, Baron." Her voice cracked, just barely, on the final word, a hairline fracture, gone almost before it arrived, but Alistair heard it, and something in his chest tightened at the sound, a protective instinct he had not expected to feel this strongly, this fast. Frederick heard it too, and smiled wider, the way certain men smile when they sense they have found a wound worth reopening. Relevance? No, perhaps not. Simply an old curiosity satisfied. It is rare to see a woman recover so thoroughly from such a public disappointment. "If we could return to the shipping clause," Eleanor said, and picked up the document in front of her, hands perfectly steady now, voice perfectly even, though Alistair could see, from the angle where he sat, the faint tremor in the edge of the page she held. She finished the translation flawlessly, every word correct, every diplomatic nuance caught and rendered precisely. If anyone in the room besides Alistair noticed the effort behind that composure, they did not show it. The session ended an hour later, and the moment the delegations left the room, Eleanor gathered her papers with brisk, efficient movements, the kind of movements that exist specifically to fill hands that would otherwise shake. "Eleanor." She did not stop. "Eleanor." She stopped, finally, at the door, but did not turn around. "You do not owe me an explanation," he said, "but I would like to understand what just happened, if you are willing to tell me." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, still facing away from him, she spoke. 10 years ago, I was engaged to a man named Charles Pemberton. He was clever, well regarded, considered a fine match. I believed, foolishly, that our engagement was built on genuine affection. Her voice stayed level, though each sentence seemed to cost her something to release. 3 weeks before the wedding, he discovered I had been studying languages, quietly, on my own, beyond what any young lady was expected to know. He found a stack of my notebooks, Latin conjugations, German vocabulary, notes on trade documents I had borrowed from my father's study. And he was frightened by it, not impressed, frightened. He told his family, and then his friends, and then, eventually, everyone who mattered, that he had broken the engagement because he discovered something unnatural about me. That was his word, unnatural. He never specified what he meant, which allowed everyone's imagination to fill the gap with whatever cruelty they preferred. Alistair's jaw tightened. That is not a reason to end an engagement. That is cowardice. It was easier for society to believe I had been rejected for some flaw, she continued, as though he had not spoken, than to believe a man had been frightened away by a woman's intelligence. A rejected woman is pitiable. An intelligent woman who frightens men is dangerous. Society always prefers pity to danger. It requires less examination of itself. She turned to face him then, and her eyes were dry, though something in them looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "So I let them believe I was rejected," she said. "It was simpler. It required no defense, because no one truly wanted to hear one. I built a smaller life around that story, and filled the empty corners of it with languages no one thought to ask me about, until the day your notice arrived." Alistair crossed the room before he had fully decided to, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. "He was a fool," he said, "frightened by the very thing that makes you extraordinary." Perhaps. Not perhaps. Certainly. Something passed between them then, brief and unspoken, and for a moment the treaty, the delegations, the entire weight of the fortune balanced on the next several days, all of it receded into the background of the room, leaving only two people standing closer than either had quite intended. The moment did not last. Alistair, still burning with the particular anger of a man who has just learned someone he cares for was wronged, made the same mistake many well-meaning people make. He carried that anger into a place it did not belong. At dinner that evening, with several household staff present and the memory of the afternoon still sharp in his mind, he spoke without fully weighing his words. "Miss Whitmore was treated abominably today," he said, to the table generally, though his eyes stayed on Eleanor. "A man questioned her past in front of foreign dignitaries, implying some flaw that never existed. I will not have it repeated under this roof." He meant it as defense. It was received as scandal. By the following morning, the story had already reformed itself in the mouths of the staff, twisted the way stories always twisted when passed hand to hand through a household hungry for something new to discuss. The Duke had defended Miss Whitmore at dinner, some said, his voice heated, his eyes fixed on her the entire time. There must be something between them. Why else would a duke raise his voice over the honor of a hired translator? Edward, the young footman with unguarded opinions, repeated the story to a maid in the kitchen that morning, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, the way gossip always grows richer the further it travels from its source. Eleanor heard a version of it by midday, delivered second-hand through Clara, who reported it with the gentle awkwardness of someone bringing unwelcome news to a friend. "They are saying there is something between you and the Duke," Clara said, "because of what he said at dinner." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. 10 years of careful invisibility, undone in a single well-meaning outburst, replaced now with an entirely new story for society to devour, one that painted her not as a rejected spinster, but as something worse in the eyes of certain circles, a woman who had inserted herself into a duke's household and his affections both. She found Alistair in his study an hour later, and her voice, when she spoke, held none of the careful neutrality she usually maintained. "You should not have spoken as you did. I was defending you. I did not ask to be defended in front of an entire dinner table. I have spent a decade learning to survive gossip by starving it of fuel. You handed it a feast. I could not simply sit there and let that man—" "You could have," she said, "and you should have. I have managed worse than Baron Ashgrove for 10 years without anyone's rescue. What I cannot manage is a fresh scandal built from your good intentions." He opened his mouth to argue and closed it again, recognizing too late the truth in what she said. "I am leaving Thornwood Hall," she said. "The remaining sessions can be handled with the notes I have already prepared. You do not need me present for the final signing. Eleanor, I will not become your scandal as well as my own, Your Grace. I have carried enough weight alone. I do not intend to carry yours too." She left the room before he could answer, and the sound of her footsteps down the corridor felt, to Alistair, like the sound of something ending before it had truly been allowed to begin. He stood alone in his study for a long time afterward, surrounded by treaty documents that suddenly felt meaningless compared to the silence she had left behind, and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives once it is too late, exactly how badly he had mishandled the one thing in his life that had actually mattered. Eleanor packed her trunk with the same efficiency she brought to everything, folding each garment with quick, practiced motions, stacking her notebooks in careful order at the bottom where they would travel safest. Her hands did not shake. She had trained them over many years not to shake in front of anyone, including herself. Clara appeared in the doorway partway through, wringing her apron between her hands, clearly torn between duty and genuine concern. "You do not have to leave, miss. Whatever is being said below stairs, it will pass. These things always pass." "They pass," Eleanor said, "and then they return, reshaped, waiting for the next quiet moment to strike again. I have lived inside one story for 10 years, Clara. I have no wish to add a second." He did not mean any harm by what he said. "I know." Eleanor closed the trunk with a soft, final click. That is rather the trouble with good intentions. They rarely ask permission before they cause damage. She left Thornwood Hall an hour later in a hired carriage, watching the great stone house shrink behind her through the small back window, feeling something in her chest pull tight with every turn of the wheels, though she could not have said, if asked, whether it was relief or loss. Perhaps, she thought, it was both, tangled together the way most true feelings tended to be. Her cottage, when she reached it 2 hours later, felt smaller than she remembered, quieter than it had any right to feel after only 2 weeks away. She set her trunk down in the front room and stood for a long moment, listening to the particular silence of a house with no one else inside it, a silence she had lived inside for a decade and had somehow, in a fortnight, forgotten how loud it could be. She unpacked slowly. She made tea she did not drink. She sat by the window with a book she did not read, staring instead at the lane outside, half expecting, though she refused to admit it even to herself, to see a carriage bearing the Thornwood crest come rolling up the road. None came, that first day or the next. At Thornwood Hall, Alistair faced the final stretch of negotiations without her, and the difference was immediate and brutal. Devereux, sensing weakness, pressed harder on every clause. The Prussian delegate, no longer facing a translator sharp enough to catch every trick, allowed subtle ambiguities to creep back into the language of the agreement, small enough that Alistair, without Eleanor's trained eye, did not catch them until later, reading alone at night, cross-referencing documents with none of her ease or certainty. He fumbled through a session on the 13th day so badly that Devereux, normally too controlled to show satisfaction, allowed himself a small, private smile that Alistair caught and understood completely. Without Eleanor, he was exactly what he had been before she arrived, lost in a language he did not speak, surrounded by men who understood exactly how much that cost him. That night, alone in his study, Alistair stared at the treaty documents scattered across his desk and admitted, finally, what he had been avoiding admitting since the moment her carriage disappeared down the drive. He had not lost a translator. He had lost the one person in years who had looked at him and seen something worth being honest with, and he had repaid that honesty by handling her pain so clumsily that it had cost her the very peace she had spent a decade building for herself. He thought of Charles Pemberton, the man frightened away by her intelligence, and felt a fresh wave of anger, though this time directed partly at himself. Pemberton had run from her because he was too small to stand beside someone brighter than himself. Alistair had not run. He had done something arguably worse. He had claimed to defend her, and in doing so had exposed her all over again, to a different crowd, wearing a different, equally unwelcome story. He thought of his Aunt Margaret's words, delivered so long ago it felt like another lifetime. Beggars do not get to choose the color of the rope. He was no longer a beggar in matters of translation alone. He understood now that he had been begging, quietly, for something else entirely, something he had not recognized until it walked out his study door and did not look back. 2 days passed. 2 days of stumbling negotiations, of watching the treaty his family desperately needed slip further from favorable terms with each passing session. 2 days of lying awake at night, replaying the moment at dinner when his own anger, however well-intentioned, had cost him the one person capable of fixing everything he was currently ruining. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived from Baron Ashgrove's household, forwarded through the delegation, containing a piece of correspondence that had apparently circulated among certain society circles, referencing Miss Whitmore's departure from Thornwood Hall in terms that made Alistair's hands curl into fists before he had finished the first paragraph. The letter painted her as scandalous, opportunistic, a woman who had used her position in his household to angle for something far beyond her station, only to be sent away once the truth of her intentions became clear. None of it was true. All of it would be believed, exactly the way the story about Pemberton had been believed a decade earlier, because society preferred convenient cruelty to inconvenient truth. Alistair read the letter twice, then set it down with the particular, controlled calm of a man deciding something irreversible. He called for his horse before he had fully finished deciding what he intended to do once he arrived, and rode out from Thornwood Hall with the treaty documents still scattered across his desk, unattended for the first time in 2 weeks. The ride to Eleanor's cottage took just over 2 hours, and every mile of it gave him time to rehearse words that all sounded insufficient the moment he tried them in his own head. Sorry felt too small. I should not have spoken carried the weight of an apology without the weight of understanding. Somewhere around the final hill before her cottage came into view, he stopped rehearsing entirely and decided simply to speak whatever arrived once he saw her face. Eleanor was in her garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt beside a row of herbs she had planted years earlier and mostly ignored since, her sleeves pushed up, her hands stained with soil, looking nothing at all like the composed translator who had faced down 2 foreign delegations without flinching. She heard the horse before she saw him, and rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, her expression carefully neutral in a way that told him she had prepared herself for exactly this possibility and was determined not to let it show how much preparation it had required. Your Grace. Formal, distant, a door closing politely rather than slamming. Eleanor. He dismounted and stood at the edge of her small garden gate, uncertain, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, of whether he had the right to step through it. I have made several mistakes. Several is generous of you to admit. I defended you clumsily, in front of people who turned my defense into fresh gossip. I have since learned that gossip has already reached society circles, painting you as something you are not, and I bear responsibility for that as well. She said nothing, waiting, the same patient stillness she brought to every difficult document. The negotiations have suffered without you, he continued. Badly. Devereux has regained ground I cannot recover alone, but that is not why I rode here today. Then why? Because I sat in my study for 2 days, he said, surrounded by documents I could not properly read, and realized that the thing I actually could not live without was not your translation. It was you, your mind, your honesty. The way you have spent a decade quietly building something extraordinary out of a world that told you your intelligence made you unwanted, and never once let that world's cruelty convince you to stop. Eleanor's composure, so carefully held in place, wavered slightly at the corner of her mouth, though she did not yet let it fall entirely. That is a fine speech, Your Grace. It is not a speech. It is an apology, delivered badly, by a man who has never had much practice at either honesty or apology, and who is asking, humbly, for the chance to do both better than he has managed so far. The garden held its silence a moment longer, filled with the small sounds of birds and wind through the herbs she had planted and mostly ignored, and Eleanor studied him the way she studied every document placed in front of her, searching, he suspected, for whatever hidden clause might still be lurking beneath his words. She did not find one, not this time. The final signing is in 2 days, she said finally. Yes, you still need a translator. I need far more than a translator, Eleanor. But yes, I need that too. A long moment passed between them, weighted with everything neither had yet said aloud, and then Eleanor turned back toward her cottage, calling over her shoulder as she walked, in a tone that held, for the first time in the conversation, something close to warmth. Fetch my trunk from inside, Your Grace. It appears I have a treaty to finish. The final session began in the same drawing room where it had all started, though the atmosphere now carried a different weight entirely. The accumulated pressure of 2 weeks compressed into the single afternoon that would decide whether the Thornwood family kept its fortune or lost it entirely to men who had spent every session searching for a crack wide enough to slip through. Eleanor sat at Alistair's side, her papers arranged in the same precise order she always kept them, her expression composed once more, though anyone looking closely might have noticed the small, private glance she exchanged with him before the delegations entered, a glance that carried none of the professional distance from 2 weeks earlier. Devereux entered first, and his eyes found Eleanor immediately, his expression flickering with something close to surprise, quickly hidden. "Miss Whitmore, I had heard you departed." "I returned," she said simply. "Duke Thornwood required my services." "How fortunate for him." "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "It is." Baron Ashgrove entered a few minutes later, and the smile he wore upon seeing her present again was thinner than the one he had worn days earlier, a man recalculating an advantage he had believed already secured. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "back again. How resilient." "Baron Ashgrove," Eleanor replied, her tone perfectly level. "How predictable." The room settled into tense silence, and the final round of negotiations began. Every trick the delegations had attempted while she was absent, every quiet ambiguity that had slipped into the language during her 2 days away, Eleanor caught within the first hour, laying each one out plainly for Alistair, translating not just the words, but the precise nature of the trap hidden within them. "Here," she said, pointing to a clause the Prussian delegate had introduced only the day before. "This phrase appears harmless. It states that shipping disputes will be resolved according to established maritime custom. It does not specify whose maritime custom. English precedent and Prussian precedent differ substantially on liability in cases of storm damage. If left as written, every future dispute becomes a fresh negotiation, weighted in whichever direction the wealthier party can afford to argue longest." Alistair struck the clause without hesitation, replacing it with specific language Eleanor dictated on the spot, closing the gap before either delegation could object with any real force. Devereux, watching this unfold, allowed a small, appreciative nod, the gesture of a skilled opponent recognizing when the game had shifted decisively against him. "You are formidable, Miss Whitmore," he said, in French, clearly testing whether she would translate her own compliment honestly. "He says I am formidable," Eleanor told Alistair, in English, without hesitation. "I agree with him." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, even Devereux's mouth curving briefly, the tension breaking just enough to let the final hours of negotiation move with something approaching goodwill. By late afternoon, every clause had been reviewed, every trap disarmed, every ambiguity closed with language precise enough to satisfy both delegations without leaving room for future exploitation. The treaty sat on the table between them, finished, whole, secure in a way it had not been since the negotiations began. Before the final signatures were placed, Alistair rose from his seat, and something in his posture made the entire room quiet before he had said a single word. "Before we conclude," he said, "I would like to correct something." Devereux raised an eyebrow. Baron Ashgrove's expression sharpened with immediate wariness. "2 weeks ago," Alistair continued, "this treaty nearly collapsed because I had no one capable of understanding the language it was written in, let alone the games hidden beneath that language. I was fortunate enough to find Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a woman this society has spent a decade dismissing, ignoring, and reducing to a single old story about a broken engagement that was never her fault to begin with." Eleanor went very still beside him, her eyes fixed on the table, though he could see her hands tighten slightly around the edge of the document in front of her. "She speaks 7 languages fluently," Alistair went on, "and reads 2 more. She caught insults buried in diplomatic courtesy that my previous translator missed entirely. She found a clause that would have cost my family its northern shipping lanes forever, hidden in 6 words no one else thought to examine closely. Whatever this society believes it knows about Miss Whitmore, I would ask each of you to understand this instead. This treaty exists in its current favorable form because of her mind, and her mind alone. I do not introduce her today as my translator. I introduce her as the reason my family's fortune survives at all." Then Devereux, of all people, began to applaud, slow and deliberate, followed a moment later by several members of his own delegation, the sound gathering weight as it spread, until even Baron Ashgrove, stiff and clearly unwilling, offered a few reluctant claps of his own rather than stand out as the only one who refused. Eleanor sat frozen through all of it, unaccustomed to praise delivered this loudly, this publicly, after a decade spent learning to expect the opposite. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright, though she blinked quickly, refusing to let anything fall. The treaty was signed within the hour, terms secured firmly in the Thornwood family's favor, the delegations departing that evening with considerably more respect for the household than they had arrived carrying 2 weeks earlier. That night, once the last carriage had disappeared down the long drive, and the house had finally gone quiet, Alistair found Eleanor in the study one final time, though this time neither of them carried any documents at all. "You did not have to say what you said today," she told him. "In front of everyone. I did, actually. I have spent 2 weeks watching you carry a decade's worth of unfair judgment with more grace than most people manage in a single difficult afternoon. I was not going to let that room finish its business without understanding exactly who had made it possible." She studied him for a long moment, the same careful, searching look she gave every letter placed in front of her, searching, he suspected, for whatever hidden clause might still be waiting beneath his words. "What happens now?" she asked. "Between us." "That depends entirely on what you want it to be." "And what do you want it to be, Your Grace?" He crossed the room, the same way he had crossed it once before in her garden, though this time there was no gate between them, no uncertainty holding him back. "I want a wife," he said, "who catches the trap hidden in 6 quiet words before anyone else in the room even notices there is danger. I want a partner clever enough to frighten men too small to deserve her, and brave enough to keep building something extraordinary anyway, even when the entire world insisted she stop. I do not want a translator, Eleanor. I have never wanted only a translator. I want you, exactly as difficult and exactly as gifted as you actually are, for the rest of my life." Eleanor's composure, held so carefully through a decade of quiet dismissal, through 2 weeks of grueling negotiation, through a public reckoning she had never expected to witness, finally broke, not into tears, but into something closer to laughter, soft and disbelieving, and entirely real. "7 languages," she said, "and not one of them prepared me for this conversation." "Good," Alistair said. "I would rather surprise you than translate for you, just this once." She stepped closer, closing the last small distance between them, and the answer she gave him needed no translation at all, understood perfectly in any language, by anyone who has ever waited a decade to finally be seen exactly as they are. The wedding that followed, months later, was attended by nearly everyone who had once whispered about the spinster no one wanted, each of them arriving with careful smiles and carefully rewritten memories, eager now to claim they had always known she was remarkable. Eleanor greeted every one of them with the same composed grace she had once used to survive their cruelty, though now, standing beside a husband who had chosen her loudly, publicly, and without a single reservation, she found she no longer needed their approval at all. She had spent a decade being fluent in languages no one thought to ask about. She spent the rest of her life being understood, finally, in every single one of them.